Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Anti-Doping Podcast, brought to you by the Partnership for Clean Competition. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and today we are delighted to be joined by our guest, Holly Shick. Listeners, Holly is Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer at the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee, or USOPC. She's also Vice Chair of the Board of the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Museum and a member of the Board of Governors of the Partnership for Clean Competition, or PCC. And today, listeners, we're looking forward to discussing Holly's career and some of the important work that she has been doing with the USOPC. So, Holly, welcome to the show today. How are you?
I'm doing great, thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm excited to chat with you about your work, but perhaps we can give our listeners a little bit of background to start with. Can you just tell us a little bit more about yourself and maybe how you got interested in pursuing a career in law?
Yeah, so I'm originally from Eastern Pennsylvania in the Poconos. I went to Penn State to undergrad, go Lions, and then I went to American University, Washington College of Law in Washington, D.C. Before I went to law school, I worked at a law firm on the recommendation of a former college professor of mine who used to be a partner at a law firm. Thought it would be good experience and a good way to figure out if that's what I wanted to do. So I ended up in Washington, D.C. as a paralegal, and a lot of people who kind of grow up in their young adult life in Washington, D.C., they kind of end up going to law school because that's what everyone else does by default in Washington, D.C. So I don't really have a great story about how I got interested other than I thought it would be a useful degree to have. And fortunately, in my last semester of law school, I did an externship with the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, D.C., and that brought me to what I wanted to do, which was to be a trial lawyer. I did that for 8 years, if I'm remembering correctly and doing the math right. So I was really lucky and very fortunate to get a job there, which has ultimately, I'm sure we'll talk about later, led me to where I am today.
I think that's wonderful. And I think these career paths are sometimes serendipitous in terms of how you end up where you are. And you have a particularly cool path in terms of how you started working in sports specifically. So can maybe we go into a little bit more detail on just the steps that you took to get to where you are today at the USOPC from getting involved in law in the beginning?
The steps I took in my career were not aimed at getting into sports. I was always interested in working in sports, but I never thought that it was realistic because it's quite difficult to break in. But what I ended up doing in my career eventually helped me get to the USOPC. So I was very lucky in that way. So at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, D.C., and then in Salt Lake City, Utah, I investigated criminal cases and I tried criminal cases, did a little bit of white collar related work, but learning how to investigate and interview witnesses and get a sense for what was going on in a particular case was super helpful, particularly for this job. And working with all different types of people from all different walks of life was also very helpful. And then from there, I decided that once I was done with trial work, I decided I wanted to explore compliance. And so when I was living in Salt Lake City, Goldman Sachs has a really large presence in Utah. So I pursued some opportunities there. I was really fortunate and got a role with their then emerging consumer retail business called Marcus by Goldman Sachs. Part of it still exists today. It's scaled back quite a bit. But that's where I really learned about compliance and audit and all the things that helped me pitch myself for this position. And what led me here ultimately was just a connection. A close friend who I worked with back in the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C., he was at Major League Baseball and he sent this job description for the role I have now. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to apply for it, even though I don't know if I'm qualified. We'll see if they take me. And I'm still here almost 6 years later. So I feel really, really fortunate that he thought of me. And to me, I always share with younger folks who are in law school or looking to pursue a career in whatever, that it's just important to keep in touch with your friends and people who you like, because you just never know where that will lead you and who might think of you when an opportunity comes up. So I always think it's important to network, but in a really organic and authentic way.
Oh, absolutely. Keep those connections warm and make sure you're keeping in touch with people. I think that's great advice. And you mentioned that you were always interested in sport, but kind of didn't think it would be possible. So were you an athlete yourself, or was there a particular sport that you were super passionate about?
I was a high school athlete, not a very good one, but I always loved watching sports because it's just something that my family did a lot of. We were big Philadelphia Eagles and Philadelphia Phillies fans. So sport was just part of my life and part of that culture in Eastern Pennsylvania. People are really, really passionate about sports. And that's why I've always kind of been interested in getting into the sports industry.
Well, I think that's wonderful. And I think you do have a really cool position there at USOPC now. So let's talk a little bit more about your current role, Holly. What exactly do you do as the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer there?
So I have 3 teams that report up to me. We are a small but mighty group of about 13 to 14 people, depending on whether we have a vacancy. We have compliance investigations. We have compliance operations. And then we also have an audit team that audits not only our national governing bodies, but also audits the USOPC. So high level overview, we are responsible for making sure that the USOPC and our national governing bodies, there are 52 of them. So that's a lot. If you think of Major League Baseball teams, I don't know, there's maybe 28, 30. So we have almost double that, which is quite a bit. And they're all different capabilities and sizes. So we're responsible for making sure that those folks and USOPC comply with the federal requirements under the Ted Stevens Olympic and Amateur Sports Act, which is the federal law that governs the Olympic and Paralympic movement. We're also responsible for making sure that everyone complies with our bylaws and then policies and procedures that apply both to us and to the national governing bodies. So that's a super high level, 30,000 foot overview.
Absolutely. And you mentioned earlier that you've been in this role for about 6 years now. And this was actually a new role that was just created in 2020. So can you maybe give us some of the background or the history of why the USOPC ultimately created this new position in 2020?
So my role was unfortunately born out of the USA Gymnastics scandal and Larry Nassar. So the USOPC, when that all came to light, hired outside counsel to do a completely independent investigation. Following that investigation, there was a volunteer group of individuals that came together. There were athletes represented, national governing body representatives, and then independent individuals. And that group was called the Borders Commission. And there was a report that the Borders Commission issued that included recommendations, most of which, I think maybe all of which, the USOPC adopted. One of those recommendations was to create a position for a chief compliance officer, which would be the equivalent of an inspector general within a government agency, for example. And then another recommendation was that the chief compliance officer be responsible for overseeing national governing body compliance and that there be a more formalized and robust national governing body compliance program and also a compliance program for the USOPC.
Absolutely. And I think this is a really important role. And I'm glad to see that action was taken to develop this position. And it sounds like you're doing an amazing job in leading it. But can you talk about what it has been like? I mean, you started this role in 2020, which was not an easy year to start anything. But then you had to build this compliance program just from scratch there at the USOPC, just from the ground up. So what was that experience like for you, Holly?
It was really challenging because if you look around at different professional leagues and other sport organizations, not many of them have a dedicated compliance function. So compliance and risk assessments, all of those types of things are not as emphasized and focused on at sports organizations. So this was really a new concept to the USOPC, and huge credit to our CEO, Sarah Hirschland, who really supported this position and continues to support this position and function. But it was really challenging getting our national governing bodies to understand the concept of an audit and findings and deadlines and all the things. There had been kind of a checklist type program before, but nothing like this where NGBs were being audited against a whole new set of compliance requirements. And those audit reports are published. And as you can imagine, that gives people a lot of heartburn. And so it took a few years to build a really collaborative relationship with NGBs such that they felt that we weren't after them just to get after them, and that we weren't just making findings to make ourselves look good and justify our roles, but really to be able to support them, to help them be the best organizations they can be, both from a governance and operational standpoint without getting into the weeds of their day-to-day business. But we've come a long way, I think. I think we have great relationships with our national governing bodies. We have a lot of programs in place today that are there to support them rather than us just touching base with them once every 4 years to do an audit. So I think that we've really evolved not only as a department, but also as an organization and our relationship with our national governing bodies.
Absolutely. And can you maybe chat a little bit about how the team has grown and evolved? You mentioned that there's these three streams of people who are reporting up to you. Was this sort of in place when you started, or is this something where you had to build the team as well?
We kind of had it in place. We definitely had an audit team. And when we had a compliance team, what I did was I took the compliance team and separated those into two different teams, which now we call compliance investigations, integrity and investigations, and then compliance operations. So the compliance operations team is the team that makes everything run behind the scenes. Integrity and investigations, they are responsible for conducting compliance investigations of NGBs where we have jurisdiction to do so. And then they're also responsible for leading up our sport integrity program, which includes sports betting, competition manipulation, and sharing insider information. And they also respond to reports that are submitted through what we call our integrity portal, which some people might call a whistleblower hotline.
Excellent. Well, let's talk a little bit more then about the ethics and compliance culture there. You mentioned this was a new idea that you were introducing into this space, particularly in this Olympic and Paralympic sport. So how has this culture evolved since you started working there and since this position was created in 2020 with a new emphasis on this?
I think the movement has come a really long way. We now have a dedicated ethics and compliance committee at the USOPC that not only addresses conflicts of interest type questions and reviews policies, but they also provide input into our strategy. We provide regular reporting to them. And so they're overseeing USOPC compliance. We also have another committee that I support called the National Governing Body Oversight and Compliance Committee. And that committee is dedicated completely to national governing body compliance. So just that by itself speaks a lot to how much the USOPC supports a culture of ethics and compliance within the movement. We also just have people who reach out with questions now because they know that there's a dedicated resource to answer those questions and dedicated policies and procedures to address them. And then, of course, the NGBs have come quite a long way as well. As I mentioned, they oftentimes reach out with questions. And I think that that demonstrates that they trust that we are a partner to them rather than feeling like they're going to reach out with a question and get in trouble somehow.
I think that's really important, that kind of trust and the conversation really going both ways. And I know ethics and compliance covers a lot of ground, and anti-doping is just a small piece of it. Could you maybe just give listeners a sense of the breadth of different areas that you cover?
I'm glad you mentioned the anti-doping piece. So I serve as the anti-doping liaison to USADA and to WADA and to the IOC. So USADA, obviously, those folks are amazing and they are the best in the world at what they do. They are the anti-doping experts. As it relates to any kind of policy related matters that implicate the USOPC, that's kind of where I come in. And the USOPC is also a signatory to the World Anti-Doping Code. So what we do here is we make sure that when an athlete is subject to a provisional suspension, or if there is an anti-doping rule violation imposed, that they understand what benefits they are no longer available to them through the USOPC. So that's an important part of what we do on the anti-doping front. And then on the sport integrity front, as it relates to betting and competition manipulation, we have a contract with a monitoring service that monitored and looked for any kind of suspicious betting activity during the Olympic and Paralympic Winter Games in Milan Cortina. We do training for NGBs and for athletes. So any person who went to the Olympic or Paralympic Winter Games had to take a mandatory training on competition manipulation, sharing insider information, and sports betting. So there's a lot of work, as you can imagine, that goes into that as well.
Oh, absolutely. And you mentioned the Winter Games that just wrapped up. I'm sure many of our listeners tuned in, and you highlighted particularly your team's role in kind of monitoring and ensuring that there weren't suspicious sports betting practices going on. But were there other ways that you and your team played a role in either preparing for the Winter Games or being engaged during the games?
We do get engaged during the games. Before the games, we do tend to get questions or concerns related to the application of selection procedures. And oftentimes we will refer athletes to our athlete ombuds who can help mediate between an NGB and an athlete and help explain to an athlete what their options may be in challenging something. So we work closely with our ombuds office. And then during the games, we are there to handle any disciplinary related matters. So all of the delegation members sign essentially a code of conduct. And if there are alleged violations of that, we are there to help and address those. And so we had a couple during the Olympic Games, unfortunately. They were pretty minor, And then nothing during the Paralympic Games, which was great. So we are there and available as a resource for that type of work, but we're also there because it's an all hands on deck situation. So we're there to pitch in wherever we're needed.
That makes sense. And just to give people, without mentioning any names or calling anybody out, what is maybe an example of a code of conduct violation that may occur during Olympic Games?
One really easy example would be to bring alcohol into the athletes' village, which athletes are not permitted to have there for some obvious reasons.
Right. That makes sense. And maybe what was your specific involvement during the games, Holly? Did you have specific roles?
I was there in my regular capacity. One of the things I did when I was there that took up quite a bit of time was connecting with individuals from the International Olympic Committee who were there for the games as well. So there was a whole series of meetings the first full week of the games on sport integrity and the IOC promoting its sport integrity program and allowing countries to share best practices with each other, which was quite helpful. And then also just engaging with some other individuals that I oftentimes speak to on the phone or through WhatsApp. To connect in person is always really helpful because we don't get over to Europe all that much and vice versa. So that was another important part of what I was doing over there.
That's fantastic. And I think just the experience of being there on the ground during the Olympic and Paralympic Games is just so cool. So for you, what were some of the highlights?
The last Winter Games we had was in Beijing, which was really challenging in 2022 because China was very restrictive, understandably so, and people couldn't travel to the games. And I did not go to Beijing for the Winter Games, but being able to attend a Winter Games and seeing fans in the stands was really, really cool, just like it was in Paris for the Summer Games. And then I was really fortunate and had the opportunity to attend a couple of men's and women's hockey games and also speed skating. So getting to go to things I wouldn't necessarily go to see here at home. And then also just the overall vibe of the Olympics, seeing people come together, regardless of what their politics are, what else is going on in the world, I think is a really cool unifying moment that doesn't really exist many other places.
Absolutely. And were there any surprises or any challenges that you and your team ran into while you were there at the games?
Not in my team, but I think the biggest challenge, which a lot of people have already talked about in the news media, is logistically, there are a whole bunch of different locations throughout Italy that made traveling between locations quite difficult. So many of us who were there, if we were assigned to what we referred to as a cluster, we would stay in that cluster. So I was in the Milan cluster and I did not go to the mountains because we didn't want to put any undue burden on the drivers who already had quite a job driving 4 or 5 hours up in snow-covered roads. That's not something I wanted to do anyway. So I was happy to stay in Milan.
Oh, I think that's wonderful. And I think for you and your team, you probably get a short break to catch your breath, but then you're on to the next thing. We've got the Winter Olympic and Paralympic Games are over, but LA 2028 is just around the corner now. So how will your team begin to prepare for the next Olympic and Paralympic Games?
Being in Milan was actually a huge help in preparing and thinking about what LA will look like, because much like Italy, LA will be pretty spread out. And in fact, I don't know if a lot of people know this, but canoe kayak and softball will be in Oklahoma City. You also will have cluster type situations in California, and then you'll have folks that are going to be in Oklahoma, which I think will be a super cool experience. So that kind of helped us prepare and think about where we should be or whether we should be there. We're in Colorado, so we're like a 2-hour flight from LA. So I think that's an open question. And then also thinking about sport integrity, sports betting, competition manipulation. Sports betting, as many listeners know, continues to grow exponentially. And with that growth becomes the threat of one of our Team USA athletes being involved. Hopefully not, but you see it quite a bit in the NCAA, unfortunately, and in some of the professional sports. So doing all we can to educate people. We have home games that's done with integrity and where no Team USA athletes are implicated. We just want to make sure we educate them so they understand what they can and can't do. And also so they understand what some of the consequences could be, which could be quite serious. So we're looking at a strategy for best educating our summer sport athletes and NGBs on betting, insider information, and competition manipulation. And really, we'd like to try to get in front of as many people live as we possibly can. So that's what we're looking towards for LA 28.
Very cool. So do you have a sense of what these education opportunities might look like?
I think that covering those 3 main things, sports betting, competition manipulation, sharing insider information, And giving people an opportunity to engage with a live person rather than a video training is really important because it gives them an opportunity to ask questions that they might have, but they don't get an opportunity to ask. So we've thought about doing kind of a risk assessment and thinking about what sports are highest risk and are most bet on and focusing on those sports to have live trainings. And then, of course, we would do others as needed. But there are, I think, 28 summer sports. So it would be challenging to get in front of all of them live, but we'll certainly try to get in front of as many of them as we can in person.
I think that's phenomenal. And I think people don't maybe realize how much work goes on behind the scenes to prepare for an Olympic and Paralympic Games, whether it's the Summer or Winter Olympics. Can you talk a little bit about what the timeline looks like for you and your team in terms of when these things need to be rolling out, when you need to be ready for different activities leading up to the 2028 Games?
I mean, I really want to start preparing this year so we can test what we'd like to do for LA and use the Pan American Games as a testing ground. So the Pan American Games and the Pan American Games will take place, I believe, next fall in Lima, Peru. So if we can have a lot of our strategy in place and we can kind of execute on that next year and test and see how it goes, I think that's one of my goals in terms of preparing and how far in advance we need to start preparing.
Oh, absolutely. And I think when you look towards the future, there are a lot of things happening in sport. The anti-doping scene in particular, things move quickly. So what are some of the USOPC's maybe key priorities and goals when it comes to thinking about ethics and compliance?
One of our key priorities, our audit team will stand up an internal audit function. If you think about higher risk areas in other organizations, finance is always going to be one of them. There might be an audit of employee expenses. There might be an audit to determine whether the finance team is following its policies and procedures. There may be an audit of our games operations team. So audits are done to not only assess gaps and identify risks, but also to identify some operational efficiencies. And so that's an exciting thing for our organization. And our audit program will be scaled to what our business needs. And I think that there are a lot of teams within the organization that will definitely benefit for that. So we're excited about that. That's one of our biggest initiatives in the next year.
That's awesome. And then how does the audit process work? I imagine not everybody can get audited because it's an in-depth and time-consuming process, but how do you make the selections and how does the process work?
The selections are really based on a risk assessment that organizations do. Typically, that's how an auditor will first start to determine what are the higher risk areas of the organization and how do I think about prioritizing them and getting senior leadership buy-in and also buy-in from the Finance Audit and Risk Committee, which will eventually have oversight of the audit function just from a strategic point of view. And then the process itself, as you mentioned, is quite intensive. There are initial meetings to describe to the team you're working with what the scope of the audit is, what the expectations are, what the timelines are. There's testing, there are samples that are requested, and then eventually you'll have closeout meetings where you'll present your initial findings and the team will have an opportunity to respond to those findings and maybe tweak some things, maybe not. And then an audit report's issued. So that all does take quite some time. But I think, like I mentioned, it'll be beneficial to the team members that we work with.
Well, that makes sense. And in our introduction, Holly, we mentioned that you wear a variety of different hats here. You're, of course, the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer there at the USOPC. We also mentioned that you're Vice Chair of the Board of the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Museum, and you're also on the Board of Governors for the Partnership for Clean Competition. So how do you balance all of these different roles that you have?
There are some days when I'm not sure, to be honest with you, but fortunately, we have a great team, great board members on both the museum board and the PCC Board of Governors. So I try to set aside a chunk of time for each board so I can dedicate the time that that work deserves without interfering with the work that I have to do day to day. Sometimes that means I can squeeze that other work in during the day. Sometimes it means it's a later night or weekend, but all in all, it's for the good of the movement. And I'm really honored to be able to serve on those boards to help promote the movement and also to promote clean sport.
Absolutely. And we really appreciate all of the work that you're doing for anti-doping and clean sport. And I think it is really important to continue to work on anti-doping. It's sort of a work in progress, I like to say. So can you share, Holly, why you think it's so important to continue advancing anti-doping science in particular and whether new findings that are coming out of anti-doping research are informing some of the work that you're doing there at the USOPC.
At the last PCC conference in 2025, I had the opportunity to meet Shannon Roberry, who was a keynote speaker at the conference. And her story, I've always believed in clean competition. I've always believed that athletes deserve to step onto a clean playing field and they know that there is fair competition. And after meeting her, that only reinforced that belief and my desire to be able to help in any way that I can. I just can't imagine competing your entire life and believing that doing your best is what you're supposed to be doing. Meanwhile, other folks are out there taking performance enhancing drugs and other things to enhance their performance and beat other people, their competitors. And I don't know how you compete like that, number one, because I would imagine that some people feel some guilt around that. I don't know if that sounds weird, but I just can't imagine doing that. And meeting Shannon again just reinforced how doping really impacts someone. And if those of you who don't know Shannon's story, you can Google her. She was reallocated a bronze medal from the London 2012 games. So I guess it was last year that it happened, but 13 years later, she finally was awarded that medal. And there will be an actual ceremony at some point. I don't think that's mine to share, but there will be a ceremony to award her and some other Olympians who were cheated out of medals in the London 2012 games. And so we certainly don't want that to be the story for LA. And we want to make sure that we continue to advance anti-doping science to stay ahead of people and physicians and other folks who are bad actors. We don't want them to get ahead of what the research and what the science is.
Absolutely. And Holly, I'm so glad you brought up this idea of being able to hear athlete stories can have a tremendous impact on others in the anti-doping sphere who might not be directly engaging with athletes every day, because I think these stories are so powerful and it's such a good reminder of why you go in to do the hard work that you're doing every day, right?
Absolutely.
Well, I think that's fantastic. And I think it is so important to continue advancing anti-doping science, and a big role that you play is being on the PCC's Board of Governors. So can you talk about what it's been like for you, Holly, being part of this organization and being part of its leadership?
So I just started last March. In the middle of last year, we hired a new head of research programs, Rusty Smith, who has been out there promoting the PCC and the great work that the PCC does to reach as many researchers and scientists as he can to, again, promote and advance anti-doping science and research. He's doing a great job. And being able to see the work that goes into making sure that we're being thoughtful about the research grants that we are providing money for, and knowing that we'll be able to hear about that research at next year's conference, hopefully, is really exciting. And our partners at the NFL and at Major League Baseball have been really fantastic. And of course, USADA is a major contributor as well. I'm really excited about the work that we're able to do. And unfortunately, with some of the cuts to government funding, this work is even more important than ever, because the PCC and the World Anti-Doping Agency, I believe, are the only two organizations that are really focused on anti-doping scientific research. I don't know that there are a whole lot of other organizations out there with as much funding or as much reach as the PCC and WADA have.
Well, Holly, we appreciate your contributions to the PCC's board. And I think it's such a great organization and such a great group of leaders. But I know in anti-doping, you can't do anything alone. I think you have to work with all of these different stakeholders across the board. You mentioned a few of them throughout our conversation, people like WADA, USADA, the athletes themselves, different sport organizations. So can you share, how do you collaborate with other stakeholders in the anti-doping and ethics and integrity and compliance space in the work that you do every day?
Since I took over the anti-doping integrity piece and the integrity work that the USOPC does, maybe early last year, I've been trying to understand what WADA's role is, what they do, what their responsibilities are, and also understand better what USADA does. Of course, everyone knows they do testing, but understanding and learning more about how they decide to test who they need to test, all of the education that they have to do, all of the notices that they send out. They do an incredible amount of work, and it's incredibly important to the Olympic and Paralympic movement as a whole. So getting to know what they do in general and understanding their respective roles and what the USOPC's role is in that context and how we can support both of those organizations I think is one of the most important things that we do. And I hope that my work in getting to know each of those organizations and the people that are behind them will be helpful in that.
Well, I think these collaborations with different organizations are really valuable for moving the field forward and making sport just a safer, healthier, better, and more fair place to be. And I know there are often barriers. There are things that prevent you from being able to do everything that you'd like to do every day, even if that's just time, resources, whatever you can think of. So Holly, if we took the barriers away and we gave you all of the resources you could dream up, what is the one problem in sport or anti-doping that you would most want to solve?
I think the problem I would most want to solve is having the monetary resources that wouldn't necessarily come from the US, but I wish that every country had the monetary resources to really support a robust anti-doping program like we have here in the US. I think USADA is the gold standard. Unfortunately, not all countries have an anti-doping organization that does what USADA does as well as it does it. I'm not saying that there aren't other countries, but I know that there are some countries that are unfortunately just a little bit under-resourced, and WADA does important work to help fund them to some degree to do better testing, to monitor their compliance with the World Anti-Doping Code. But really, at the end of the day, it's a financial question, not just a resources in terms of people question. So I think that's the problem I'd most want to solve, to give athletes more confidence that every athlete in the world is tested to the same degree that athletes in the US are tested, and that they are stepping onto a clean and fair field of play whenever they step onto the field of play.
Absolutely. I think that's such an important point. And this notion that sport is a global endeavor, and if we can raise the bar around the world, I think that will help everybody.
Absolutely.
Well, Holly, it's been wonderful to chat with you about your work. And if our listeners are curious and they want to learn more about what you do and more about what's going on at the USOPC, where should they go?
Well, first of all, we have two different websites. If you don't already know from the Olympic and Paralympic Winter Games, we have a website that's for fans, and that's teamusa.com. That's where you can learn about all of our athletes and upcoming events. And then we also have USOPC.org, which is more of our organizational website. And if you go to About Us and then Compliance and Audit, that's where you can learn more about what me and my team does. And I also want to mention, too, that if you are inclined to donate to the Partnership for Clean Competition or Team USA, neither organization is funded by the federal government. So we are truly sponsor and fan funded. And if you are so willing to make a donation, we would very much appreciate it. And you should know when you make that donation that your money is going to support Team USA athletes and really important anti-doping scientific research.
A wonderful note to end on. Holly, thank you so much for sharing those resources. It's been such a pleasure to chat with you today and learn more about you and your work.
Thank you, Marie. I really appreciate the opportunity.
It's been great to have you here. And listeners, we appreciate you joining us as well. Make sure you check out those two websites that Holly mentioned. And if you haven't had a chance yet, make sure to take a moment as well to rate our podcast, leave a review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. And listeners, please note that the Anti-Doping Podcast features a wide variety of clean sport experts, and episodes may include statements and/or viewpoints that do not necessarily reflect the views or values of the PCC. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the Anti-Doping Podcast.